3, 2, 1 and liftoff. On the morning of January 28, 1986, millions of eyes were fixed on the skies above Cape Canaveral, Florida. The Space Shuttle Challenger roared upward, carrying 7 astronauts who represented the very spirit of human exploration. Among them was Krista Olive, a schoolteacher chosen from thousands of applicants to become the first civilian in space. Her presence symbolized hope, education, and a bold new chapter in the space program. For classrooms across America, it was more than a launch. It was history in the making. Children sat in front of televisions, their teachers pointing proudly, as Mcauliffe prepared to teach lessons from orbit. The shuttle's white plumes cut across the bright Florida sky, engines shaking the ground, and the world believed it was watching a flawless ascent. It was a powerful image of progress and inspiration. This liftoff was not just another mission. It carried with it the promise of showing that space was no longer just for astronauts, but for ordinary people too. In those first 73 seconds, the Challenger embodied everything NASA stood for: courage, innovation, and the dream of reaching beyond Earth. What no one knew, however, was that this flight would soon turn from triumph into one of the darkest tragedies in space history, a moment forever etched in memory. The day Challenger rose on that cold January morning, the Challenger sat poised on its launch pad, framed against a clear Florida sky. The world waited with anticipation, and for NASA, this was more than just another shuttle launch. It was meant to prove that spaceflight was becoming routine, safe, and part of everyday life. The countdown ticked away, and with a thunderous roar, Challenger's solid rocket boosters ignited. Flames and smoke erupted as the shuttle lifted from the pad, rising higher and higher with incredible force. The ground shook, the sky filled with vapor trails, and the voices of mission control called out the steps of a well-practiced routine. In homes, classrooms, and newsrooms across the nation, people cheered. This was a moment of unity, of national pride, of science and hope coming together. Krista McAuliffe's presence made the event even more meaningful. For teachers, for students, and for ordinary people, it felt personal. America wasn't just sending astronauts. It was sending one of its own, a teacher, into space. Challenger climbed into the heavens as cameras rolled and broadcasters narrated what looked like a flawless ascent. The promise of exploration was alive, and the nation's spirit soared with the shuttle. In those moments, nothing seemed capable of going wrong. A teacher among the crew, Krista McAuliffe, was not a career astronaut. She was a 37-year-old high school teacher from Concord, New Hampshire, who loved her students and believed education could change the world. When NASA announced the Teacher in Space project, over 11,000 applicants sent in their names. Krista was chosen and her life was transformed. Her mission was simple yet powerful: to inspire. She would teach 2 live lessons from orbit, showing children everywhere that space was not just for scientists or pilots, but for ordinary people with big dreams. Her selection captured hearts across the country. She became a symbol of hope, of possibility, of America's future reaching beyond Earth. For months leading up to the launch, she trained with the Challenger crew, learning survival procedures, practicing in simulators, and preparing for the journey of a lifetime. Students across the nation followed her story closely. Many classrooms were set up with televisions that day, ready to watch their teacher in space. For those children, Krista was proof that even someone like their own teacher could touch the stars. On January 28, she boarded Challenger with the same excitement she had shown from the very first day. She smiled, waved, and carried the dreams of countless students with her. In that moment, she wasn't just an astronaut. She was every teacher's voice, every child's dream. Millions watched live as Challenger climbed into the sky. It wasn't just another space launch. It was a national event. Across America, millions tuned in to see history unfold. News networks broadcast the mission live, anchors speaking with excitement about Krista McAuliffe and the significance of her role. In classrooms, children sat cross-legged on the floor, eyes glued to televisions that had been rolled in on carts. Teachers stood proudly, telling their students they were about to witness the first lesson ever taught from space. Families gathered in living rooms, cheering as the shuttle lifted off. For NASA, this was proof of its vision-sized spaceflight as part of everyday life, something so reliable that it could be shared in real time with the public. The sight of the shuttle rising against a clear blue sky was mesmerizing. The roar of the engines, the trail of smoke, the countdown that ended in fire and thunder. It felt like America itself was lifting off. Viewers clapped, children shouted, and for those watching, it seemed like nothing could go wrong. In those 73 seconds of ascent, the nation was united in hope and pride. It was more than science, more than technology. It was a shared dream unfolding live before the world. Tragedy in the sky. 73 seconds after liftoff, joy turned to horror. What had looked like a flawless ascent suddenly became a nightmare broadcast lived to millions. In the bright blue Florida sky, Challenger's trail of white smoke split apart violently. A massive fireball erupted, sending pieces of the shuttle arcing in opposite directions. For a brief moment, confusion filled the airwaves. Broadcasters hesitated, unsure of what they were seeing. In classrooms, teachers and children stared at the screens, their cheers replaced with silence. Families at home gasped in disbelief. Mission Control's calm voices fell quiet, replaced by stunned silence as they tried to understand what had happened. The shuttle that had carried so much hope and promise was now gone, replaced with plumes of smoke drifting slowly across the sky. Bits of debris sparkled in the sunlight as they tumbled toward the ocean below. The moment that was supposed to inspire a generation instead seared itself into the memory of everyone watching. It was not just an accident. It was a tragedy witnessed live, in real time, by the nation and the world. In a matter of seconds, the dream had shattered, and history was rewritten in fire and silence. NASA's first story. In the hours after the explosion, NASA rushed to provide answers. The world was in shock, and millions demanded to know what had happened to the 7 astronauts on board. Senior officials stood before cameras and reassured the public with a simple, firm narrative: the crew had died instantly, without pain, at the very moment the shuttle disintegrated. It was a message designed to bring closure, to soften the unbearable grief facing families and the nation. The explanation sounded certain, almost comforting in its finality. Newspapers repeated it, broadcasters shared it, and memorials were built on the idea that the crew had been spared awareness of their fate. For many, this story became the truth, etched into memory as the official account. Yet behind the scenes, questions lingered. Engineers, investigators, and even some inside Mission Control quietly wondered if the story was as clear-cut as NASA claimed. The silence after the explosion had been chilling, but was it truly the end for the crew? Despite these doubts, the agency held to its version. At a time of national mourning and political pressure, NASA's first story was meant to protect, to simplify, and to shield both itself and the families from a darker, more painful reality. Instant death claim. From the very beginning, NASA emphasized one point above all others: the astronauts never knew what happened. Officials claimed that the force of Challenger's disintegration was so sudden and so extreme that the crew would have lost consciousness instantly. To the grieving public, this explanation was easier to accept. It meant the 7 astronauts were spared terror, spared pain, and never had to face the reality of their situation. Families were told that their loved ones did not suffer. News outlets repeated the line for weeks, turning it into the accepted truth. Even memorials and documentaries leaned on the narrative of an immediate, merciful death. But the certainty of those claims was fragile. NASA offered little technical detail to support them, and internal documents quietly suggested a different story. The instant death message was as much about reassurance as it was about facts. In a moment of national mourning, NASA wanted to protect its image and prevent a deeper horror from reaching the public. It was easier to frame the tragedy as sudden and final rather than prolonged and haunting. For decades, this claim stood unchallenged. Yet over time, fragments of evidence would begin to chip away at it, exposing a far more painful truth. Doubts begin to grow even in the days following the tragedy. Not everyone accepted NASA's story at face value. Engineers, investigators, and some members of mission control quietly questioned whether the crew could have truly died instantly. The silence from the cockpit seemed strange, and fragments of wreckage recovered from the Atlantic began to raise unsettling questions. Families of the astronauts also wondered if they had been told the whole truth. Why had some emergency systems appeared to be used? Why did certain pieces of hardware look as if they had been manually activated? Whispers began to circulate within technical circles. Was the official version too neat, too simple? For the public, those doubts were buried beneath grief and the desire for closure. But behind the scenes, evidence was piling up that contradicted NASA's claims. Reports hinted that the crew cabin might have remained intact after the explosion. Some investigators suggested the astronauts could have been alive for part of the descent. These doubts didn't yet reach the public, but they grew stronger with every new piece of debris pulled from the ocean. The instant death story was cracking, and beneath it lay a truth far harder to accept: that the Challenger crew may have fought to survive. Wreckage from the ocean. In the weeks after the explosion, recovery teams worked tirelessly across the Atlantic, 18 miles off the Florida coast. Divers, ships, and helicopters searched day and night, pulling pieces of the shuttle from the waves. What they found was both heartbreaking and revealing. Among the thousands of fragments, the most critical was the crew compartment, still largely intact despite the violent breakup of the orbiter. This discovery alone cast doubt on NASA's story of instant death. If the cabin had survived the explosion, then perhaps so had the people inside. Investigators also recovered vital equipment, including the operational voice recorder known as Ops Recorder Number 2. Though badly damaged by saltwater, this small device would later prove essential in uncovering the crew's final moments. The wreckage told a story piece by piece: scorched metal, torn wiring, and equipment that showed signs of manual use. Each recovery suggested the astronauts had been alive long enough to act. The ocean floor became both a graveyard and a crime scene, holding answers NASA had not shared. Families and the public were told little, but behind closed doors, the evidence was undeniable. The Challenger's wreckage carried a truth too heavy to stay buried. The hidden recorder, among the debris lifted from the Atlantic, one small device would change everything. The operational voice recorder, known as Ops Recorder Number 2. At first glance, it looked useless, soaked in saltwater, corroded and battered by weeks at the ocean floor. Unlike the black boxes used on commercial planes, it wasn't designed to survive catastrophic accidents. Its purpose was technical, meant only to help engineers review routine missions after they ended. Yet this humble piece of equipment held the crew's final voices. When NASA recovered it, the agency downplayed its importance, telling the public it contained nothing meaningful. For years, that claim stood. But behind the scenes, specialists at IBM painstakingly worked to restore the tape. Through careful cleaning and advanced methods, they coaxed sound from the damaged reels. What emerged wasn't meaningless noise. It was proof the astronauts had been alive and communicating right up to the shuttle's breakup. The recorder captured not only routine chatter, but also a chilling final phrase from pilot Michael J. Smith. NASA never intended for the public to hear it, and for a long time, it remained hidden. But when the truth finally surfaced, this small device became the most haunting evidence of all. Michael Smith's from the restored audio of the Challenger's ops recorder came a phrase so brief, yet so devastating, that it rewrote the story of the disaster. At exactly 73 seconds into the flight, just as the shuttle began to lurch violently, pilot Michael J. Smith's voice broke through the static with two simple words. Oh. It was not casual chatter. It was the instinctive reaction of an experienced pilot who instantly recognized that something had gone catastrophically wrong. This single phrase carried enormous weight. If Smith had time to speak, it meant he was conscious, aware, and still in control of his thoughts when the shuttle began to tear apart. For decades, NASA had reassured the world that the crew died instantly, sparing them awareness of their fate. But Smith's words told a different story. A story of a crew who realized the danger and faced it head-on. That faint was more haunting than any explosion seen on television. It was proof that, for at least a few moments, the Challenger astronauts were alive, responding and fighting for survival. It is a detail so small, yet it changes everything about how we remember that morning in 1986. Air packs tell a tale. When investigators examined the wreckage, they found something that shattered NASA's official story. 3 of the 7 astronauts' personal egress air packs, small emergency breathing devices, had been manually activated. These packs weren't triggered automatically, they had to be switched on by hand. One belonged to pilot Michael J. Smith, but evidence showed it couldn't have been turned on by him. That meant another crew member likely reached over in the chaos to activate it for him. This detail speaks volumes. If the crew died instantly, there would have been no time for such actions. Instead, the activated air packs reveal that at least some astronauts were alive, conscious, and trying to help each other after the shuttle broke apart. It is a heartbreaking glimpse into those final minutes. Proof of training, teamwork, and courage even in the face of hopeless odds. NASA didn't share this evidence immediately. For years, the public narrative remained that death was quick and painless. But the air packs told a different tale, one written in quiet, human actions. In those desperate moments, the Challenger crew did not give up. They fought to survive, and they fought together. Evidence of survival piece by piece. The evidence recovered from Challenger's wreckage painted a haunting picture. The intact crew cabin, the faint words on the restored voice recorder, and the manually activated air packs all pointed to one chilling truth: the astronauts did not die instantly. Instead, they survived the shuttle's violent breakup at 48,000 feet and remained alive during a long, tragic descent toward the Atlantic. NASA's own medical analysis later confirmed that the forces of disintegration were likely not strong enough to cause fatal injury. This meant the crew may have been conscious for much, if not all, of the 2.5-minute fall. Investigators could not say exactly what the astronauts experienced, but the signs of deliberate action, switching on air packs, following emergency steps, prove they tried to respond. These weren't the final seconds of life, vanishing in an instant. They were moments of effort, training, and survival instinct. For years, this evidence was buried in technical reports and quiet discussions, while the public was told a simpler, softer version. Yet the truth cannot be erased. The Challenger crew endured, however briefly, showing courage even as their fate was sealed. The tape that changed all, the operational voice recorder, once dismissed as unimportant, became the piece of evidence that changed everything. After weeks underwater, it was corroded and nearly useless, but IBM specialists managed to restore its fragile audio. What they uncovered directly contradicted NASA's claim of instant death. The tape captured the Challenger crew in their final moments. Calm voices performing routine tasks, acknowledging commands, even light conversation. Then, as the shuttle lurched violently, came Michael J. Smith's chilling, This single phrase, preserved against all odds, revealed that at least one astronaut was fully aware when disaster struck. Subtle background noises in the final seconds suggested even more: that the crew may have been attempting emergency procedures as the cabin tumbled toward the ocean. Combined with the evidence of activated air packs, the tape destroyed the illusion of a painless, instant end. Instead, it proved the crew fought to live, however briefly. For NASA, this recording was never meant for public ears, but once revealed, it reframed the entire tragedy. Challenger's story was no longer about sudden loss. It became about courage in the face of the impossible. Gene Kranz speaks out. When Gene Kranz, NASA's legendary flight director known for saving Apollo 13, finally broke his silence about Challenger, his words carried undeniable weight. Kranz had not led the mission, but he was in mission control that morning, watching events unfold in real time. For decades, the public believed NASA's official story, that the crew died instantly. But Kranz revealed a darker, more painful truth: the Challenger astronauts most likely survived the breakup and remained conscious until impact with the ocean. His reflections matched the evidence: an intact crew cabin, manually activated air packs, and the restored recorder. To Kranz, this wasn't speculation but fact. He stated bluntly that NASA had lied about those final moments, softening the truth to protect its image and shield the families. Coming from anyone else, the claim might have been dismissed, but from Kranz, the embodiment of honesty and accountability inside NASA, it demanded attention. His words forced the world to confront the reality that the crew endured 2.5 minutes of awareness and struggle. When Gene Kranz spoke, the myth ended, and the truth of Challenger could no longer be ignored. Alive until the ocean, the most haunting truth to emerge from the Challenger investigation is that the crew likely remained alive until their cabin struck the Atlantic. After the orbiter disintegrated at 48,000 feet, the reinforced crew compartment separated intact and continued climbing for nearly 25 seconds, reaching almost 65,000 feet. From there, it began a long, tumbling fall, 2 minutes and 45 seconds of descent before slamming into the ocean at 207 miles per hour. NASA's medical experts concluded the breakup forces were not enough to kill or even seriously injure the astronauts. Evidence showed they had activated emergency air packs, proving they were conscious and working together in those terrifying moments. They were not spared awareness, as NASA once claimed. They endured the fall, trained professionals facing the unthinkable. It is impossible to know their exact thoughts, but the signs of deliberate action show they fought to survive until the very end. The ocean impact, not the explosion, was what claimed their lives. This revelation transforms Challenger's story from one of instant loss to one of courage and struggle, making the tragedy even more heartbreaking and unforgettable. 2.5 minutes, 2 minutes and 45 seconds. That was the time the Challenger crew spent falling toward the Atlantic after the shuttle broke apart. It may seem like a short span, but in those moments it was an eternity. The cabin, though battered, stayed intact as it arced upward to nearly 65,000 feet before beginning its fatal descent. Inside, the astronauts were alive, strapped into their seats, their training guiding their actions. Evidence shows that some activated emergency air packs, and one even reached over to help a fellow crew member. These were not signs of panic but of professionalism, men and women doing what they could to survive against impossible odds. The descent was merciless. With each second, the crew cabin tumbled through the sky, powerless against gravity. Mission control went silent. Families and classrooms stared at TV screens, unaware that the astronauts they mourned might still be alive. The ocean grew closer, and the astronauts endured every moment until impact at 207 miles per hour ended it all. Those 2.5 minutes remain one of the most haunting spans of time in spaceflight history. Proof of human courage and the unbearable cost of failure. The crew fought to live. The Challenger astronauts were not passive victims of a sudden explosion. The evidence shows they fought to live until the very end. The manually activated air packs proved that at least 3 crew members were conscious after the breakup. One air pack belonging to pilot Michael J. Smith had been switched on by someone else, showing that even in chaos, the astronauts were helping one another. This small act revealed both awareness and teamwork. The crew cabin remained intact, and though stripped of wings and engines, it offered a fragile pocket of survival as it tumbled toward the Atlantic. NASA's own medical reports later confirmed that the breakup forces were not instantly fatal. These men and women, trained for emergencies, conditioned to stay calm under pressure, likely used their last moments to follow procedures, to act, to hope. They had no control over their fate, yet they refused to give in to despair. For 2.5 minutes they held on, not as passengers but as astronauts, working together, surviving as long as possible. In those final moments, the Challenger crew displayed the courage and determination that defined their mission, even as the odds proved impossible. Why NASA stayed silent if evidence suggested the Challenger crew survived for minutes after the breakup? Why didn't NASA admit it from the start? The answer lies in a mix of grief, politics, and image control. In the hours after the disaster, the nation was in shock. Families were watching, classrooms full of children had seen the tragedy live, and the agency faced immense pressure to respond. By insisting the astronauts died instantly, NASA gave the public a simpler, less horrifying narrative. One that offered closure and spared families from imagining their loved ones' final struggle. But there was more. Acknowledging survival would have meant deeper scrutiny of management decisions, engineering flaws, and ignored safety warnings. It would have magnified the agency's responsibility and exposed it to greater legal and political risk. At a time when the Shuttle program was already under fire, NASA chose to protect its image. For years, officials held to the instant death story, burying details in technical reports and avoiding public discussion. Whether to shield families or shield itself, NASA's silence delayed the truth. But silence cannot last forever, and eventually the evidence forced its way into the light. Politics and image. The Challenger disaster was not only a technical failure, but also a political crisis. The Shuttle program had been sold to the public and to Congress as safe, routine, and essential to America's leadership in space. The explosion shattered that promise in front of millions of viewers, including schoolchildren. For NASA's leaders, admitting that the crew may have been alive for minutes afterward